Everything that the government could possibly need to know about my identity can be found in a bright yellow folder which I keep in a secure place, labeled Documents. It contains a rough outline of my life, my birth certificate, my first driver's license, my GED, my marriage certificate, and the document that I fought for hardest of all, my certificate of legal name change. I started the process of making my name change official in 2010, and after a long and complicated battle with the New Jersey court system, it was finalized at last in the state of Massachusetts in 2016. Now my passport will tell you what I've long considered to be true, that my name is Miranda Lennox. And I know this may come as a surprise, but the name that I go by most, Bran, is actually a shortened form of Miranda. I love my name, and I have no intention of changing it again. Changing your name is hard. I'm not just talking about background checks and a never-ending series of phone calls to the court who can't seem to locate your file. It's also a hard social process. If I remember correctly, I took on the name first when I was 14, but no one really called me by it until I left home and began introducing myself to new people with it. I didn't originally change my name for gender reasons. My birth name was actually more gender neutral than Miranda, but because the name I'd been given at birth never really felt true for me. My whole childhood, it felt like I was a pepper shaker labeled salt, and I went through a series of increasingly outlandish nicknames in an attempt to get some relief from it. When people ask me how I found my name, I always say that my name found me. I saw it on the spine of a book in the library, and I knew right away that it was mine. Discovering the nickname Bran was a very similar process. I was searching for about 4 years for the right variation, which more easily represented my gender presentation, and then one day I saw Bran in a list of Irish mythological figures, and knew immediately that I had found it. But back when I originally retired my birth name, the social response was not so smooth. The people who knew me growing up had trouble understanding why I would want to change my name. A lot of people close to me found it hard to remember not to call me by my old name. Some people thought it was ridiculous, immature, or even insulting for me to ask them not to use my old name. After I moved away, it was hard because I couldn't afford to change it legally yet, and it made a lot of things confusing when my documents didn't match the name that people knew for me. These days, a lot of those troubles are behind me, but I'm endlessly thankful to the people who surround me nowadays and how they were much more gracious about adjusting to Bran. Even so, it's still nerve-wracking to tell people about this history. It's always hardest when people interpret it as an invented identity rather than an affirmed identity. Now that I spend a lot of my social time in queer and trans circles, I find myself surrounded by people with chosen names. It's a common in-joke that non-binary people tend to name themselves after the nearest noun. Stone, cricket, morning, pecan, clay. It was much to my chagrin when I realized that Bran is also a noun. But the truth is that discovering a name is a sacred process that takes time, energy, and sometimes quite a bit of trial and error. I certainly feel the magic of names expressed through love and appreciation when a friend shares their naming journey with me. There's an indescribable beauty in this expression of self-discovery, and it resonates in tune with the forms of self-becoming we find in the journeys of trans and gender nonconforming people. One of the criticisms that I hear most about the increasing prevalence of non-traditional relationships to gender, as well as the practice of renaming, is that it contributes to a culture of individualism. And I would argue that it's far from it if you put it in the right context. Now, if someone is receiving non-traditional gender expression as people trying to force them to call us by a certain name or pronouns to externally reinforce an invented identity, then it makes sense that that would feel divisive, right? But what if instead this were all about people offering up their true self to the best of their knowledge, knowing that honesty and vulnerability are the foundation of a healthy community? What's more, if you are part of a community that affirms people as they share their truths, it will give you the same care and support when you, inevitably, learn something new about yourself. It helps us all to be part of this type of dynamic. I have no real unified theory on why some names feel right to us and others don't fit or stop fitting at some point. I do, however, have a theory of gender that I'm willing to share. I'm aware that this is nowhere near a universally accepted line of thinking, even within trans community, but I've grown rather attached to it for my own understanding of the world. I believe that gender is a spiritual construct. We know that it can't be a physical designation. Even if it's conflated with biological sex, there is a wide variation in how humans develop. Could it be a social designation? Well, it's often treated as such, but gender is deeply personal. Sometimes we play with the social elements of how gender is expressed, perceived, and responded to, but that interaction is not determinative. I have known people in their 70s and 80s who have been closeted their entire lives and intend to remain that way, and yet have still been their true gender in their heart all along. And when we grow too attached to a social definition of gender, we also risk reinforcing the lies which patriarchy teaches about how to perform a gender role correctly. Collectively, I think we're ready to accept the need to let go of assigning a feminine or masculine nature to certain garments, features, activities, and personal traits. So if gender isn't physical or social, then maybe it's cultural. That makes sense, right? A common suggestion is that gender is how a person is perceived in context. Well, where that breaks down for me is that then I would be one gender here at Sanctuary, and a different gender when I walk down the street in my neighborhood, and a different gender when I visit Kansas, and yet another one when I walk into a drag night. For folks in dominant cultural strata like whiteness and affluence, this may seem like a strange assertion. And that's likely because one of the privileges of belonging to a majority group involves experiencing smaller distinctions between the norms of each cultural location to which an individual may be aligned. The more minority groups we belong to, the less our cultural Venn diagram looks like a circle, and we may feel the shifts in location more intensely. But in spite of myself, I am tickled by this idea of transforming into different genders depending on what room I go into. And this is because my specific sub-identity within the non-binary umbrella is multigender. This means that I feel like my experience contains a number of gender alignments, and certainly at different times one might be at the forefront of my inner landscape while others drift in the background. However, the channel changer on my gender alignment is contained within me. Yes, I always feel more feminine when it's raining, but that's not because someone else looked at me and decided that for me. Other people's opinions don't change my gender. Indeed, no one can decide your gender for you. And this is why I believe that gender is a spiritual construct. So many of the coming out stories I've heard from my fellow trans people have boiled down to, underneath it all, I just knew. And I suppose the converse corollary of this is what I've heard from agender folks, that is, people who identify as having no gender at all. Agender people usually say, as hard as I looked in myself, I couldn't find any gender. Like many of us, when I first started to come out to myself as non-binary, I spent quite some months prevaricating about being not trans enough. I worried about co-opting the identity of this marginalized group. At the same time, I couldn't deny what I felt in myself. I couldn't deny the stunned feeling of rightness that I felt when a friend accidentally referred to me with the pronoun they. I couldn't ignore the realization that my psychic sense of my body was a different size and shape from my physical body in a way that insisted I embrace that sense of myself if I ever wanted to be free. I'm glad that ultimately I found the courage to claim this identity. And since that time, many brilliant trans thinkers have pointed out to me that defining trans belonging by suffering is not good for our community. I have learned to embrace gender euphoria as just as powerful and important as dysphoria. Introspection about gender is not just for people under the trans umbrella either. I've known many cisgender people, that is, people whose identity matched the gender they were assigned at birth, who have spent some time in contemplation and exploration around their own identities. And they've shared with me that when they do this introspection and still discover that they are cisgender, their relationships with themselves and their community deepens. That deep resonance of having a truth within yourself that you just know, it reminds me of how people experience faith. Some people just know God. Some people believe in many things. Lots of relationships to the divine feel right to them. And for some, it changes throughout their lives. And just as valid, some people search within themselves and find no signs of God. In communities like Sanctuary, we make space for open and respectful conversations about our diverse and heartfelt relationships to the divine. And for the same reasons, we celebrate and make space for our diverse and heartfelt relationships to gender. To know your gender is to know your soul. To share that knowledge with others is to reveal a deep place of self-knowledge and to trust that it will be treasured. When I say, "Hi, I'm Bran, and I go by they, them pronouns," what I'm actually saying is, I invite you into my truth. Will you join me? What might we do together when there is space for each of us to thrive?